Joining me in our studio to have a look at COVID passports is Ricky Lambert from our Flow News 24 team. Good morning, Ricky.
Good morning.
I want to ask firstly about the international travel passports. We're seeing Europe has a green card for people to travel through Europe, and Australia, for the moment at least, we've closed international borders to a degree, albeit that some people are now allowed to return home from India and so forth. But is there a place at a national level between our states where a COVID passport could be implemented?
Well, there may be a place in the minds of politicians, but in my mind, absolutely flippin' not. Why do we even bother having a federation if you now need passports to go between states? And the whole reason for it is the concern about transmission of COVID. We've already got people travelling between states within Australia without a passport arrangement and no community transmission. Why the heck do we need to have a passport to go to Victoria or to Queensland or New South Wales? I think it's farcical.
Okay, let's look at some of the background to this. The Prime Minister initially said that when the vaccine became available, that it would be compulsory. He quickly backflipped because a lot of his backbenchers came to him and said, you're going to get kicked out of office real quickly. So suddenly it was not going to be mandatory. But now we're seeing some of his comments would seem to indicate that if you want to travel over a border, it would be mandatory.
Well, this all sounds like pandemic politics yet again. Prime Minister trying to look tough on borders and trying to shift the blame to state premiers and saying, well, they're looking like they're weak-kneed on borders. We've had the Premier of Queensland, Premier of New South Wales and the Premier of Western Australia, who was, funnily enough, very hard on borders before the state election. But now he's saying, look, I would remain to be convinced about needing a passport to go in and out of Western Australia. Isn't it interesting?
It is interesting, and then move this back a step. In South Australia, the onset of COVID-19 back in March of 2020 saw an initial 4 deaths. Since that time, more than 12 months, there has not been any deaths in South Australia as a result of COVID-19. Interestingly enough, in Victoria, we had this massive number up until September due to a mistake made by the Victorian government in its hotel quarantine process. But since that time, we've virtually had no deaths in Victoria and none in New South Wales. The isolated number, 910 now, is the number. We haven't had that dramatically increase in any sense in this past 12 months since the early onset. And so one asks the question, with that in mind, why are we actually looking for a COVID vaccine passport to travel between states? The likelihood of dying from COVID-19 now is very low.
It's minuscule, and I just think people are entitled to be angry about these types of ideas of a vaccine passport. Why can't governments just do their bloody job? Why do the citizens have to have all of the burdens and imposts put on them when if governments managed outbreaks properly, managed their hotel quarantine properly, we wouldn't have to take on another imposition of our liberty? Don't forget that it won't just be about travelling between borders. That passport, which would be on your phone, you wouldn't be able to buy a beer at the pub or have a meal at a restaurant or go into a stadium or a cinema unless you can show them this passport. That's what they'll do because they'll think, well, legally, we need to protect ourselves from an outbreak lawsuit, so we're going to say you need to show your passport to do business or entertain yourself anywhere. What
about the New South Wales Premier, Gladys Berejiklian? She's slammed the idea, saying she's opposed to an interstate vaccine passport. I think that Gladys's record, when you consider New South Wales the largest populated state within Australia, has had a really good record in terms of the number of deaths in that state per head of population.
Well, Gladys Berejiklian has performed in a way, a term I used to like to use in politics, proportionately to the danger that has been there. They've talked about dealing with clusters, like the Northern Beaches cluster. They didn't lock down people in Broken Hill or Riverina because of a cluster on the Sydney's Northern Beaches. A proportionate response to this crisis. But these flippin' politicians, I'm pretty angry about this. They want to just go harder and harder because they know there's a voting demographic, a fearful older demographic, who don't get out much anyway. They're quite happy to have everyone else's liberties restricted it, and I think it's ridiculous.
Okay, it would seem that if we've almost eradicated the death rate from COVID-19 since, let's say, September of last year, the Victorian circumstance, where we had those 800 cases quite quickly in that particular location, then if we've done that with treatment programs, there must be now certain ways that they have treatment. A person contracts COVID-19, they're treated for it, that the likelihood of them dying is now extremely low. So is there a place for not having a vaccine at all?
As in allowing someone to have the choice not to take the vaccine.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's a human right, in my view. You can't have a government that forces people to have a vaccine or restricts their freedom of movement or their freedom to do a whole range of other things because they have or haven't had a vaccine. COVID-19 isn't the only thing out there that will kill you, folks.
Yeah.
There's heart disease, and we're going to declare war on heart disease and say that we're going to restrict products and options. We're going to get rid of sofas and recliners because people sit in them too long and develop heart disease. This is the same logic with COVID extended to some of the other big killers in our country.
All right, it's an interesting one, Ricky. Some really interesting thoughts that you've given us. Here's another one as we move on from this topic, that if you were to drive a car on our roads right now, then you are much more likely to die in a road accident than you are from COVID-19. And maybe it's something that governments should be considering if we're going to get to the point where we're going to tie people down onto having a vaccine for a passport, then maybe we should look at the age of giving a person a driver's license, for instance. Maybe that needs to be changed and the age go up for it, because there are greater risks for those that drive a car when they're younger and so forth. I think we have to look at a proportionate response, as Ricky said, and measure what the risks are. And accordingly, it looks like we're getting an overkill from politicians who I think like to put border restrictions in place for electoral purposes.